Story 1. You ever get that strange feeling that your room changes at night? Like the same walls that make you feel safe during the day somehow start breathing once the sun goes down. That night, I learned just how thin that sense of safety really is. I was 15, old enough to stay up late, but still young enough to get nervous about every sound the house made after dark. I had just gotten home from a late shift at a local diner. The place always smelled like grease and syrup, and no matter how hard I scrubbed, that smell followed me home. I remember kicking my shoes off by the door, yawning, and heading to my room just wanting to crash. It was a normal night, quiet, nothing out of place. My mom was asleep, and my brother was probably still up watching TV in the living room. The air felt heavy though, that weird stillness houses get after everyone settles down. I threw my work shirt on the floor and started changing. That's when I caught my reflection in the window. At first I thought it was just me, the kind of double take you do when the glass catches your movement wrong. But as I turned, I noticed something that made every part of me freeze. There was a man's face in the window. It wasn't my reflection. It was pale, expressionless, and pressed close enough that I could see fog from his breath on the glass. For half a second, my mind went blank. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I just stared. Then instinct kicked in, and I dropped straight to the floor, heart hammering so hard it felt like it might break my ribs. The first thing I did was reach up to turn off my lamp. The room went dark, and the only light came from the faint street glow outside. I remember thinking maybe it was a trick of the glass, maybe just my imagination, but I couldn't shake that image, that blank human face looking right at me. When I dared to peek up again, he was gone. The window was empty. I stayed there for what felt like forever, barely moving, just staring at that same spot. I thought maybe I should yell for my brother, but something in me didn't want to make a sound. Then out of nowhere, something moved outside the window again. This time slower, deliberate. I couldn't see a face anymore, but what I saw next made my stomach twist. A hand holding something. A small metallic object pointed straight at me. It took me a second to understand what it was, but once the realization hit, it was worse than seeing the face. It was a camera. Whoever was out there wasn't just watching, they were recording. Every instinct told me to run, but I couldn't feel my legs. My body just refused to move. I was stuck on the floor, half-dressed, watching that small black lens glint through the glass. My thoughts were a mess. Was this some kind of sick prank? A break-in? Someone from work? Every possibility felt worse than the last. Finally, I forced myself to crawl toward the door. I didn't dare stand up. I just moved slow and quiet, trying not to draw any more attention. The second I was out of my room, I sprinted down the hallway, yelling for my brother and mom. They came running. My brother half asleep but instantly alert when he saw the look on my face. I told him someone was outside my window, that I saw a man with a camera. He didn't even question it. He grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and headed straight for the backyard. I stayed inside with Mom, shaking so bad I could barely talk. When he came back in, his face said everything. He told us there was nobody there, no sign of anyone hiding or running. But near the base of my window, lying flat in the grass, was our old aluminum ladder, the same ladder we kept behind the shed. It had been dragged out and propped under my window, like someone had planned this. The police came later that night after Mom called them. They took a report, looked around, even dusted the window for prints. Nothing. No footprints, no smudges, nothing useful. The only thing they said was, maybe it was a prank, maybe some neighborhood kid messing around. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But the thing that never sat right with me was how quiet it had been. Our house was surrounded by gravel and old wood fencing. Anyone walking out there would have made noise. And the face I saw wasn't just some kid fooling around. It was too still, too deliberate. For weeks after that, I couldn't sleep in my room. I tried, but every creak or rustle made me feel like someone was outside again. Eventually, I moved my bed to the other wall, away from the window. I kept the blinds closed tight. I even taped them down once because I couldn't handle the idea of them shifting in the night. One night, maybe a month later, I woke up around 2 a.m. The whole house was quiet except for the ticking clock in the hallway. I told myself not to look, but I did anyway, toward the window. The blinds were still closed, but for a split second, I saw the faint flash of light behind them. Just one quick flicker, like a camera flash. I froze all over again. Waited, listened. Nothing else happened. The next morning I went outside to check, and the ladder was gone. My brother swore he hadn't touched it. That was 15 years ago, and I haven't thought about it much since. Or at least I tried not to. I still don't know if it was some twisted prank or something worse. Maybe someone just passing through. Maybe someone who'd been watching for a while. But sometimes, late at night, when I walk past windows and catch my reflection, I still hesitate for a second. Just long enough to make sure it's only me looking back. And when I do, I always keep the blinds closed, just in case. Story 2. Nights always feel heavier when you've been watching horror movies alone. It's like the silence in the room thickens, and every shadow seems to lean in closer than usual. That was the kind of night I was having. I had been sitting on the couch, half watching a string of scary films, when my stomach started growling. The craving for something greasy and comforting hit me hard, and I figured a late-night Taco Bell run would do the trick. It was close to midnight, and the streets outside my apartment complex were usually quiet at that hour. I didn't think much of it, just grabbed my keys and headed for the door. The second I turned the knob and pulled the door open, something happened that froze me in place. A hand, pale, thin, and reaching, slid into the doorway as if someone had been waiting for me to open it. My brain didn't even process it fully before instinct took over. I slammed the door shut as hard as I could, feeling it connect with whatever that arm belonged to. My heart was pounding so loud it drowned out everything else. I stood there for a second, gripping the knob, trying to convince myself I hadn't just seen what I thought I saw. The first thought that hit me was that someone was trying to break in. I lived alone, and the idea of someone lurking outside my door in the middle of the night was terrifying. I ran to the kitchen, grabbed the biggest knife I owned, and shut off every light in the apartment. I pulled down the blinds, locked every window, and sat in the dark, clutching the knife like my life depended on it. My ears strained for any sound, footsteps, breathing, anything. But all I could hear was the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing in the distance. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. My phone sat on the table, and I kept debating whether to call the police. But what would I even say? That a hand reached into my apartment? It sounded insane, even to me. Still, the fear was real. I sat there in silence, every muscle tense, waiting for something else to happen. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to peek outside. I moved slowly, inching toward the window, careful not to make a sound. My hands were shaking as I lifted the blinds just enough to see the ground outside. What I saw made my stomach drop. Scattered all over the walkway in front of my door were dozens of Chinese food menus. They were spread out like someone had tossed them in a hurry, fluttering slightly in the night breeze. That might not sound like much, but here's the thing. I hadn't seen anyone delivering menus in the building earlier that day, and even if someone had been dropping them off, why would they shove their hand into my apartment as soon as I opened the door? The timing was too perfect, too deliberate. It felt like whoever or whatever was out there had been waiting for me specifically. I stood there staring at the mess of papers, trying to make sense of it. My rational side told me it was probably just some delivery person who got too close to the door at the wrong moment. Maybe they were trying to slide a menu inside and I panicked. But the image of that hand, reaching in, slow and deliberate, wouldn't leave my mind. It hadn't looked like someone fumbling with a flyer. It looked like someone was trying to grab me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the dark until the sun came up, knife still in hand, waiting for another sound or movement. Nothing else happened, but the unease lingered for days. Every time I walked past that door, I felt like something was on the other side, waiting for me to open it again. Even now, I can't decide what really happened. Maybe it was just bad timing and my imagination running wild after a night of horror movies. Or maybe it was something else, something I can't explain. All I know is that I've never looked at late-night food runs the same way since. Story 3. They say some nights are heavier than others. The air feels thick, and even your own breath sounds strange, like the world's holding itself still for something you can't see yet. That's how it felt that night. The kind of night that seems to warn you before anything actually happens. I was a volunteer EMT in a small village just outside New York City. I'd been doing shifts for a few years, mostly routine stuff, falls, fainting spells, the occasional car accident. Nothing I couldn't handle. But this call came in late, close to midnight, when the streets go quiet and the radio chatter turns hollow. It was for a man in his 20s with a facial injury at a private residence. Nothing major on paper. The only odd part was that the dispatcher mentioned there'd be no police backup available. Usually we had at least one unit on scene before us, especially in that neighboring village. It wasn't the safest area, and even though I'd been doing this for a while, I still didn't like going in alone. It was just me and the driver that night. He was older, calmer than I was, the type who cracked jokes to make the silence less creepy. We pulled onto Birch Hollow Road, one of those stretches lined with worn-out apartments and dim streetlights that flickered like they were running out of power. The address was near the end, an old building with a small open yard in the back. From the start, something felt off. The building looked empty. No lights in the windows, no sounds, no one waiting outside waving us down. Usually, when someone calls 911, they're anxious. They meet you halfway. But here, nothing. Just that still, heavy silence again. I got out first, scanning around with my flashlight. The dispatcher had said the patient was in the backyard. My gut twisted at that. Why the backyard? Injured people usually stay near the front, where it's easier to spot us. But I told myself to stay calm. People do weird things when they panic. The grass behind the building was patchy and uneven, and the floodlights from the ambulance barely reached the back fence. I could make out a figure sitting near the tree line, hunched forward, still. I called out that we were EMTs and asked if he needed help. The man didn't move. Not a word, not a twitch. At first I thought maybe he'd passed out, so I took a few steps closer. That's when my flashlight flickered. Just once, but long enough to notice that behind him, in the shadows, something else moved. Quick, low to the ground, then gone. I stopped right there. My driver must have seen me hesitate because he switched on the floodlights, flooding the entire yard in bright white light. What I saw next has been burned into my memory ever since. There were figures, 5, maybe 6, standing completely still just a few feet behind the man I thought was injured. They weren't there a second ago, I swear it. They stood in a rough line, half in light, half in shadow, their faces hard to make out. For a split second, I thought maybe it was a gang, but they didn't move. They just stood there, shoulders slack, heads tilted slightly, like they were waiting for something. I shouted for them to stay back, but my voice came out shaky. My driver yelled from the cab, asking what the hell was going on. I turned to signal him, and when I looked back, the group was gone. The entire yard was empty. The man who had been sitting near the tree line wasn't there either. Not a sound, not a trace, just the wet grass reflecting the ambulance light. I remember walking forward just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. The air felt colder there, the kind of cold that doesn't make sense in late summer. My breath came out white, and for a moment, I could have sworn I heard faint whispering. It wasn't words exactly, more like someone murmuring just behind my ear, soft enough to make me doubt it was real. The driver yelled again, saying we needed to leave. I didn't argue. I ran back to the rig, slammed the door, and told dispatch to cancel the call. When they tried to reach the number that reported the injury, it came back as disconnected. No record of the caller. We filed a report when we got back to the station. I expected someone to say there'd been a mix-up, maybe a prank call, but no one could find a record of the address in the system at all. I even drove past the same road the next day in daylight, just to make sure I wasn't losing it. The building was there, but the backyard wasn't open like I remembered. It was fenced off, locked, overgrown. The grass looked untouched, like no one had walked through it in years. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd misread the location. Maybe the figures were just my eyes adjusting to the light. That's what I told myself for weeks. But sometimes when I think about it, I remember that cold spot in the grass and that soft whispering sound that followed me back to the ambulance. It's been years since that night, but I still can't shake the feeling that whatever I saw, or thought I saw, wasn't supposed to be there. And whenever I pass a quiet stretch of road at night, I catch myself checking the mirrors, half expecting to see a group of motionless figures standing just beyond the light. Story 4. Nights on patrol can feel like you're walking through someone else's dream. Quiet, off balance, and never fully real. The air gets heavy after midnight, and even familiar streets start to look like sets from an old movie. That night was one of those nights, the kind where the world feels too still, like it's waiting for you to notice something you shouldn't. I'd been on shift for about 6 hours when the call came in, a possible prowler around 1 a.m. The dispatcher said the homeowner had seen 2 people in mass across the street, standing near an old storage shed in the neighbor's yard. They weren't doing anything, just standing there, watching. Halloween had passed a couple of weeks earlier, so hearing about mass didn't raise too many alarms. People still pulled dumb pranks around that time of year. When I got there, the couple who called were waiting by their porch light. They looked nervous but not hysterical. Normal folks, not the kind that see shadows and call the cops for fun. They said one of the masks looked like the kind from those old horror movies, the hockey type, and the other was too dark to make out. I listened, took notes, and scanned the yard across the street. Nothing. The shed they mentioned sat under a dying oak tree, half covered in vines. It looked like something from a forgotten photo. I did a full walk around with my flashlight, checked behind trash cans, between fences. Nothing. No footprints, no noise, not even a breeze. After about 15 minutes, I chalked it up to a misunderstanding and told the couple to call if anything else happened. They nodded, still uneasy, and I went back to my usual rounds. About an hour later, the call came again. Same house, same people, same report. Only this time, they said the masked figures were back, and they were standing closer, near that same shed. The dispatcher told me she was still on the phone with them as I rolled up. I parked down the street with my lights off and approached on foot. The neighborhood was dead silent, except for the soft hum of a streetlight that flickered every few seconds. As I got near the property, I radioed in my location. Dispatch said the caller could still see both figures, standing perfectly still in the yard next to the shed. My stomach tightened a bit. I didn't like how specific that was. I told dispatch to stay on the line and let me know if they moved. The grass was wet from dew, and I could hear my own boots pressing into the ground. When I reached the side of the house, I could see the shed just a few yards away. My flashlight cut across the yard, catching glimpses of metal and wood, but no movement. Then in my earpiece, dispatch said the caller just saw the 2 masked figures wave and step inside the shed. I froze. I was right next to it. The timing didn't make sense. If they had gone in, I should have heard the door open or close. I took a breath, gripped my flashlight tighter, and called out a verbal warning. Nothing. The silence after my voice felt heavier than it should have. I remember thinking it was strange how even the crickets had stopped. I stepped closer, tapped on the shed door with my flashlight, and repeated myself. Still nothing. The latch wasn't locked, so I pulled it open and swung the door wide. My flashlight beam swept across the inside, and it was empty. Completely empty. No people, no footprints, no clutter. The floor was bare wood, dry and dusty. There wasn't even a place for anyone to hide. I thought maybe there was a trap door, so I checked the corners in the base. But the shed sat on short concrete blocks, raised about 4 inches off the ground. No hidden exits, no crawl space, just 4 walls and stale air. I stepped back outside and circled the area again. My radio crackled with dispatch asking if I had eyes on them. I told her it was clear. She sounded confused, said the caller swore they'd seen both figures step inside right before I reached it. I didn't know what to tell her. From where I was standing, that was impossible. I crossed the street and spoke with the homeowners again. They looked pale, eyes wide like they'd seen something they couldn't process. They said as I approached the shed, both figures had turned toward them. One raised a finger to his mask, like a shh gesture, and then both waved before slipping into the shed. That was the last thing they saw. They weren't drunk or high. Their story never changed. I stayed another half hour, searching every inch of that yard, the nearby alleys, even the trees. Nothing. Eventually, I told them to call again if anything else happened, though I could tell neither of us believed anything would. I sat in my cruiser afterward, headlights off, thinking about what I'd just experienced. I tried coming up with explanations. Maybe shadows from the streetlight created shapes that looked human. Maybe someone was playing a prank and slipped away somehow. But even as I thought that, something in the back of my head kept repeating that sound. How quiet it got before I opened that shed. The kind of quiet that feels too deliberate, like the world is holding its breath. A few nights later, I drove past that same house again just to see it in daylight. Everything looked normal. Kids' bikes in the driveway, dog toys in the grass. The shed door was open this time, sunlight spilling across the floor. It looked smaller than I remembered, harmless even. But when I parked for a second and turned off the engine, I could have sworn I saw movement, a shadow passing across the back wall. I blinked and it was gone. Probably just the wind through the trees, I told myself. That's what I still tell myself. But sometimes when I'm out on night patrol, I catch myself looking twice at dark corners or empty lots, places that seem ordinary but feel wrong, like something invisible is still standing there, watching, waiting to be noticed again. Story 5. Snow makes the world quiet in a way nothing else can. It softens everything, the air, the light, even your thoughts, until the only thing left is your own heartbeat echoing in the stillness. That night I learned that sometimes silence isn't peace. Sometimes it's a warning. It happened last winter, during one of the worst snowstorms my town had seen in years, the kind that shuts everything down. Roads were blocked, power lines sagged under ice, and the local news told everyone to stay inside unless they were emergency workers. I didn't mind. I'd spent most of the day shoveling my driveway, helping a neighbor dig out his car, and by the time night came, I was bone-tired. I remember microwaving leftovers, sitting in front of the TV, and letting an old episode of Star Trek play while I half-watched, half-drifted off. Outside, the wind howled against the windows like someone begging to be let in. I could hear the wood creaking under the weight of snow on the roof. It was cold, but inside felt safe, familiar. Sometime past midnight, I woke up to a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, just the light rattle of a door somewhere down the hallway. At first I figured it was the wind, or maybe the pressure change from the storm. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, followed by what sounded like a whisper. My name. It wasn't loud, but it was close enough that I could make out the shape of it, like someone was testing the sound of my name in their mouth. I sat up and held my breath. The noise seemed to come from my parents' old bedroom, the one next to mine that had been empty since they moved out months earlier. I hadn't gone in there much since. Something about it always felt stale. I told myself it was just my imagination. The brain does weird things when you wake up in the middle of the night. Still, the sound kept going. Soft rattling, a whisper, then nothing. A few minutes later, the handle of the door next to my room made a sharp, quick shake. That one made my heart stop. I grabbed the closest thing I had that could pass as a weapon, a cheap folding knife from my camping bag, and slowly opened my door. The hallway was darker than usual. The power was still on, but the bulb in the hallway must have been dimming or flickering. I stood there for a good 30 seconds just listening. The air felt heavy, like the house was holding its breath with me. The sound came again, a rustle, a low creak from inside my parents' room. I stepped forward carefully. Every board under my feet sounded like it was announcing me. The closer I got, the more certain I was that the noise wasn't the wind. It had rhythm, intent. I reached for the doorknob, and right as my fingers touched the metal, it stopped. Total silence. I waited, maybe 10 seconds, maybe longer. My pulse was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Then slowly the knob twitched under my hand. Just once. I yanked my hand back. The room stayed quiet. Against every bit of logic screaming in my head, I pushed the door open anyway. The smell hit me first. Cold, stale air, like the window had been open all night, even though I knew it hadn't. My flashlight barely cut through the dark. The shadows in the corners looked thicker than they should have been. I took a few steps inside, trying to convince myself this was stupid. Maybe a draft, maybe some loose latch on the window. I was halfway across the room when I felt it. Something brushed against my leg. Light but definite, like fingers closing around my ankle. I jumped back so fast I nearly tripped over a box behind me. My flashlight flew out of my hand and clattered across the floor. The beam spun wildly, catching glimpses of furniture, and then, just for a split second, a shape near the far corner. Too quick to describe, too dark to make sense of, but I swear it was crouched low, almost blending into the floor. By the time I scrambled for the flashlight, it was gone. Nothing there. Just an empty room, old carpet, and the faint sound of the storm outside. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to convince myself it was my mind playing tricks. Maybe I'd brushed against a blanket or something that had fallen. I turned the light toward the window. The glass was fogged from the cold, but there was something drawn on it, a small smeared handprint. It was on the inside. That broke me. I backed out of the room, shut the door, and locked it. Slept on the couch with every light on, the TV volume low, just to drown out any other sound. The next morning, I checked the room in daylight. Everything looked normal. The handprint was gone, and there wasn't anything near the window that could have caused it. No open vents, no animal tracks in the snow outside. Just an untouched, quiet room like nothing had ever happened. A friend later said I might have had a hypnagogic hallucination. Something about waking up between sleep and consciousness, when your mind confuses dream with reality. Maybe that's true. Maybe I imagine the handprint too. But every time it snows now, I think about that night. The way it called my name like it already knew I'd answer. The way that freezing air seemed to breathe back at me. And I still haven't gone back into that room after dark. Story 6. There's something about working nights that messes with your head. The world goes quiet, colors drain out, and even your own footsteps start to sound foreign. I used to tell people that night shifts make you see the world differently, like living in a photo that's stuck halfway between being developed and being erased. Back then, I worked as a security guard for a chemical storage facility on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, just long hours, empty halls, and the constant hum of ventilation units. The site was made up of two main buildings, an office and a large warehouse that held sealed barrels of industrial waste. Most of it was harmless if handled properly, but the warehouse always had this thick, metallic smell that clung to your clothes long after you left. The company only kept one light on inside the warehouse overnight. It hung high in the center of the ceiling, flickering slightly, casting the place in a half glow where shadows stretched too far and everything seemed to move when it shouldn't. That light always bothered me, but I told myself it was just my imagination and exhaustion playing tricks again. That particular week, I'd been working doubles, barely sleeping, running on caffeine and cheap snacks. My body felt heavy all the time, and my brain was fogged up. It wasn't the first time I'd caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of my eye on patrol. Quick flashes, like someone ducking behind a barrel or stepping out of view just as I turned my head. I'd gotten used to brushing it off. When you're running on no sleep, your mind starts to fill in blanks it shouldn't. It was around 3:20 a.m. when it happened, the kind of hour where silence feels unnatural. I just finished checking the perimeter fence and was making my way through the main building toward the warehouse. The air inside felt colder than usual, thick and damp like a basement. I noticed that the buzzing of the light inside the warehouse was louder than normal, almost like it was straining. When I opened the metal door, the smell hit me harder than usual. I remember wrinkling my nose, shining my flashlight around, and seeing the usual: rows of barrels, metal shelving, empty pallets stacked near the back wall. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's when I noticed it. Something pale near the far end of the warehouse floor, lying half in the light, half in shadow. It was too still to be a reflection, too solid to be a trick of the eye. My first thought was that someone had broken in. Maybe a worker who passed out, maybe worse. My stomach dropped, and I felt that surge of adrenaline that makes your hands go cold. I called out, my voice echoing across the room. Nothing. The pale shape didn't move. I started walking toward it, slowly, every step loud against the concrete. The air felt heavier with each one. My flashlight beam shook as I tried to steady my breathing. I could see more of it now, something like fabric, skin, the faint outline of an arm. I stopped about 10 feet away. My mind kept flashing between explanations. Maybe it was a mannequin, some kind of training dummy left behind. Maybe it was a pile of cloth catching the light wrong. I told myself anything that made sense, because what I was seeing didn't. The light above flickered once, then twice. The shadows jumped across the walls like they were alive. And in that split second when the light dimmed, I could swear the shape twitched. Just a small movement, barely there, but enough to make my chest tighten. When the light steadied again, it was gone. Not moved, gone. Gone. Nothing there but bare concrete. No shape, no shadow, no mark on the floor. I stood frozen, flashlight darting across the room like it could force the thing to reappear. My heart was hammering so hard it hurt. I remember backing up slowly, trying to tell myself I must have blinked at the wrong moment, that my eyes had played me. But deep down, I knew what I'd seen had been real. I left the warehouse that night without finishing my round. I didn't even turn off the light. I just locked the door and sat in the break room trying to steady my breathing. When morning came, I told the site manager I'd seen something strange. He laughed it off, said people always think they see things in that warehouse. Apparently, even the maintenance guys didn't like being in there alone. One of them once claimed he heard footsteps circling the barrels when he knew he was the only one there. I never mentioned the pale shape again. But for weeks afterward, every time I walked into that building, I'd catch glimpses of something near the floor, just out of focus, just far enough to make me doubt myself. Eventually, I switched sites. Night shifts mess with your mind, I told people. It's easy to imagine things when you're tired and alone. And I still believe that, mostly. But sometimes when I think about that night, I remember how real that shape looked, how solid, how still. And then I remember how it vanished before my eyes. So maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe the warehouse wasn't as empty as I thought. Either way, I stopped working nights after that. Story 7. Something is unsettling about silence in a house that's seen years of noise. It feels like the walls are holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. That's what it felt like the night everything decided to fall. I was 19, home alone, trying to finish a paper for my college class. I'd set up my laptop in what used to be my sister's room, our unofficial office after she moved out. Her old decorations were still there, like she never really left. The walls had a large photo of a mountain range, an oval mirror that faced the desk, and 3 wooden hangings that said faith, hope, and love. I'd never really paid much attention to them before that night. It was around 10 p.m., the kind of quiet that makes you aware of every tiny sound. Your typing, the hum of the fridge down the hall, even the faint tick of the wall clock. Outside it was windy, and the trees scratched lightly against the windows. Everything felt normal until it didn't. It started with a chill, not just goosebumps or a cold draft, but that sudden full-body shiver that comes with no warning. It crawled from my neck down my back and stayed there. I remember pausing mid-sentence and glancing at the heater. It was on, but the air felt wrong. Too still, too cold. And then it happened. Without any warning, everything on the wall dropped at once. Not one by one, not in a chain reaction. Just everything, crashing down in the same instant. The picture, the mirror, the wooden hangings, all hitting the floor with a mix of glass, thuds, and that awful scraping sound wood makes against drywall. I jumped out of my chair so fast it nearly tipped over. My first thought was an earthquake, but nothing else shook. The desk didn't move, my laptop didn't slide, and the floor didn't tremble. It was just the walls. I stood there frozen, my pulse loud enough to drown out everything else. The air felt heavier somehow, like I was being watched. I told myself maybe the nails had all loosened over time. Maybe humidity did something. Maybe it was all a coincidence. But as soon as I stepped out into the hallway, that explanation vanished. Every single thing hanging on the walls in the house had fallen. The family portraits in the hallway, the framed certificates in my parents' room, even the small shelf that held candles in the living room, all on the floor. The only thing still hanging was the TV in my bedroom, mounted tight to the wall like it didn't belong to the same reality. I just stood there staring, trying to make sense of it. There was no sound, no vibration, no storm, just stillness. It took me a while before I even moved again. The air in the house felt dense, like walking underwater. I half expected to hear something, footsteps, a whisper, anything. But there was nothing. I remember testing the living room clock to see if time itself was even moving. After a few minutes, I did the only thing I could think of. I started putting everything back, frame by frame, nail by nail, one wall at a time. It took me close to 20 minutes, maybe more. Every time I hammered a nail or straightened a photo, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half convinced I'd turn around to see everything on the floor again. At one point, I thought I heard a faint sound, something like a soft sigh coming from the hallway, but when I stopped and listened, it was gone. I told myself it was probably the wind slipping through the attic vent. Still, I worked faster. I wanted out. When I finally finished, the house looked normal again, but it didn't feel normal. There was this strange quiet, like the place was pretending nothing had happened. I grabbed my backpack, shut the door behind me, and drove straight to campus to finish my paper. I didn't even look back at the house. Later that night, when I got home, everything was still in place. Not a single frame had fallen again. My parents didn't notice anything when they came back the next day, and I never told them. What would I even say? That last night, the house let go of everything for a few minutes. It sounded insane. I've replayed that night in my head hundreds of times, trying to come up with a logical reason. Maybe some weird vibration from a passing truck. Maybe pressure changes from the heating system. Maybe I imagine the timing. But the more I think about it, the harder it is to believe every single object in the house could fall exactly at the same second. Sometimes when I'm home alone now, I catch myself listening for that sound again. The crash, the sudden silence afterward. It's been years, but the memory still makes me tense whenever I hear something shift or creak in another room. Maybe it was all just a coincidence. Maybe it wasn't. All I know is, after that night, the walls have never felt as quiet as they used to. Story 8. Snow has a way of making silence louder. That night, it felt like the whole world had been wrapped in cotton, sound trapped beneath the weight of white. You could almost hear your own heartbeat echoing against the walls. I learned that kind of silence can turn on you when you're the only one awake in a funeral home. I was working an overnight prep shift that winter, trying to finish things before a morning viewing. It wasn't supposed to be an all-nighter, just a few last-minute touch-ups, some paperwork, and locking up. But around midnight, the snow outside turned from a gentle fall into a full-blown storm. The roads disappeared, the wind howled through the trees like something alive, and before I knew it, I was snowed in. No way out until the plows came at dawn. The building was old, built sometime in the early 1900s. It had that heavy, creaking personality you only get from structures that have seen too much history. The floors moaned under your feet. The lights hummed like they resented being on. And beneath it all was the steady, low thrum of the generator that kept the basement cool. I'd worked there for years, and I thought I'd gotten used to it. I was wrong. I decided to stay upstairs in the small break room near the chapel. It had a couch, a microwave, and a coffee pot that hadn't been cleaned properly in a week. I tried to keep the lights dim, hoping to relax. For the first hour or so, everything was fine. I scrolled through my phone, listened to the wind, even dozed off for a bit. Then around 1:30 a.m., the air changed. It's hard to describe exactly what shifted, but it was like the atmosphere thickened. The temperature dropped a few degrees, and the faint hum of the generator downstairs seemed to stop for just a moment. Long enough for me to notice. Then came a faint metallic clang from the hallway. I froze. It wasn't loud, but in a place like that, every sound means something. I got up and peeked down the corridor. Nothing. Just the same row of closed doors and a flickering exit light at the far end. The clang came again, sharper this time, like metal against tile. I tried to convince myself it was the old vent system. That explanation held up for maybe 30 seconds, until one of the hallway doors slowly eased open by itself. It wasn't fast or dramatic, it just drifted open, inch by inch, stopping at an angle like someone had nudged it and let go. I stood there watching, waiting for the air pressure to shift again or the wind to push it further, but it didn't move. Everything was still. I should have just shut the door and gone back, but curiosity always wins. I walked over, trying to act braver than I felt. The room was one of the smaller prep spaces, tile floors, metal tables, storage shelves. Empty, as expected. I looked around for anything that could explain it, like a draft or loose hinge. Nothing. But while I was there, I heard a faint tapping coming from the basement stairwell behind me. Tap, tap, tap. 3 slow beats, then silence. I felt that pulse of fear crawl up my neck, the kind that tells you something's not right even before your brain can justify it. I stood still for a while listening. The tapping started again, only faster, uneven, like something brushing against metal. I tried calling out, half joking, asking if anyone else was stuck in the storm. My voice sounded too loud, no response. Just a faint shuffle from below, like footsteps moving slowly across the floor. I told myself I had to check. I grabbed the flashlight from the office and started down the stairs. The basement was dim, cold, and lined with storage units and metal racks. The air had that strange, sterile smell, like chemicals and stone. Everything looked normal until one of the hanging light fixtures started to sway gently, even though the air was completely still. I scanned the room with the flashlight. Nothing moved. No wind, no leaks, no open windows. Then came a sudden crash from the far corner, something falling off a shelf. My heart jumped into my throat. I walked closer and found one of the metal trays lying on the floor. It wasn't heavy, but it would have taken a solid bump to knock it loose. I was standing there trying to piece together a logical reason when another tray slid off the counter on the opposite wall, by itself. It didn't fall hard, just glided off and clattered onto the floor like someone had pushed it gently. That's when I heard it. Soft, deliberate footsteps moving behind one of the partition curtains. Slow, careful, like someone trying not to be noticed. I didn't breathe. I wanted to call out again, but my throat locked up. The steps came closer to the edge of the curtain, then stopped. The fabric didn't move, but I could feel the presence, like someone standing just out of sight, waiting. I backed away slowly, flashlight trembling in my hand. The curtain didn't shift, but a cold gust of air brushed past my face, and the hanging light above me started swinging harder, clinking against its chain. That was enough. I turned, ran up the stairs, and slammed the door behind me. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the chapel, lights on full, wrapped in my coat. I didn't hear anything else, but I couldn't stop glancing toward the hallway every few minutes. When the plows finally came around 6 in the morning, I didn't even wait for the manager. I just left. The next day, I came back to finish what I'd started. The basement looked the same as usual, except for one small thing. The 2 trays that had fallen were neatly back on their shelves. I asked the day staff if anyone came in before me. They all said no. I'd like to believe it was air pressure, vibrations from the storm, something explainable. But I know what I heard that night. The sound of someone walking where no one should have been walking. The faint hum of the building rising and falling like breath. And every winter since then, when snow starts piling up and the world gets quiet, I swear I can still feel that same pressure in the air. The kind that tells you something's there, just waiting for you to notice. Story 9. Some buildings don't need ghosts to feel haunted. They carry the weight of their past in the walls. The old psychiatric hall on campus was one of those places. Every creak, every draft, every faint echo from somewhere unseen felt like the building itself remembered things better left forgotten. I worked as a night security guard for the university, mostly walking the empty buildings to make sure no one was sneaking around after hours. It was a simple job, quiet, predictable, and a little boring most nights, except for the nights when my patrol route included the old psychiatric building. The university had bought it decades ago from the city, back when it was still being used for mental health research. Before that, it was an actual psych ward, built in the early 1900s, with narrow hallways and ceilings that seemed to bend in strange ways when the flashlight hit them. These days, it was just storage and old lab equipment, the kind of place students only talked about during ghost tours. There were rules for that building, though. We weren't supposed to turn the lights on inside. The reason was simple. People passing by might see the light from outside and assume someone broke in. That would mean police reports, questions, and a whole lot of paperwork no one wanted. So I did what everyone else did, kept the flashlight low, moved quietly, and got out fast. It was just past 1 a.m. when I walked in that night. The first thing that hit me was how cold it was. Not the kind of cold that comes from bad insulation. This was deeper, like the air itself didn't want me there. My flashlight beam cut through the dust and settled on old doors, each with a small square window. Some still had room numbers. Others were just blank. The building had 3 floors, and I liked to get the top one done first. That way, if anything went wrong, I'd be closer to the exit on my way down. The staircase groaned under my boots as I climbed, and the metal railing felt damp even though it hadn't rained in days. On the top floor, the air smelled faintly like bleach and rust. I started walking down the corridor, checking each room one by one. Most were empty except for broken desks and forgotten lab benches. My flashlight flickered once, and for a split second I thought I saw movement at the end of the hall. Just a shape, tall maybe, but when I aimed the light directly there was nothing. I told myself it was dust or my eyes playing tricks. I kept going, but the sound started soon after. It wasn't footsteps, more like something dragging across the floor, a slow scrape that echoed, then stopped. I paused, listening hard. Nothing. I took another step, and the noise came again, this time from the opposite direction. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, feeling stupidly nervous. My radio crackled softly, but no one was on the line. I muttered under my breath that it was just the wind, just old pipes settling, the usual excuses that help you keep moving when you don't want to admit you're scared. When I reached the end of the hallway, I noticed one door slightly ajar. The hinge made a low creak, like it had been moved recently. I figured maybe maintenance came through and forgot to close it, so I walked over to shut it. The air near that door was colder than anywhere else in the building. I could actually see my breath in the beam of the flashlight. I remember pushing the door slowly, trying not to make too much noise. The flashlight beam caught the corner of an overturned chair and what looked like a pile of old boxes. But then my light landed on something else, a figure, a tall man, easily 6 feet, maybe more, standing perfectly still in the far corner of the room. For a few seconds, my brain just refused to believe what I was seeing. My first thought was that it was a mannequin or a student prank, but the way the light hit his face, or where his face should have been, made my stomach twist. There were no clear features, no reflection in the eyes, nothing. Just this tall, unmoving shape in the dark. I took one step backward, then another, trying not to drop the flashlight. I told myself to say something, to tell him he wasn't supposed to be there, but my voice wouldn't come out. I blinked once, and when the light flickered again, he was gone. Just empty space and the faint echo of that creaking door. That's when instinct took over. I turned and ran. I don't even remember half the hallway. I just remember the sound of my boots hitting the floor and my breath catching in my throat. When I hit the staircase, my foot slipped on the second step, and I went tumbling. My flashlight flew out of my hand and clattered to the bottom, spinning so the beam flashed up the walls as I fell. By the time I hit the last step, everything hurt, but I was too scared to care. I grabbed the flashlight, bolted through the exit, and didn't stop running until I reached the security station. When I finally told my supervisor what happened, he didn't laugh. He just sighed and said I wasn't the first to see something up there. Some of the older guards had stopped doing that route altogether. They said the building had moods, sometimes quiet, sometimes not. I tried to go back the next week, figured maybe I just psyched myself out. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt it again. That cold, heavy stillness. That sense that someone was waiting. I finished my round as fast as I could and haven't gone up to the top floor since. To this day, I don't know what I saw. It could have been a prank, a trick of the light, or maybe my mind making shapes out of shadows. But every time I walk past that building now, I swear I still see something tall standing in one of the upstairs windows watching, and it always feels like it's waiting for me to come back inside. Story 10. Some nights in the country are so quiet that even your heartbeat feels too loud. The air just hangs there, still and waiting, like the whole world's holding its breath. That's how it was that night. One of those late October evenings where the fog rolls in so thick you can't tell if it's smoke or clouds kneeling down to touch the road. I was 16 and had just gotten my learner's permit a few weeks before. My mom used to say the back roads were where you really learned to drive, and I believed her. I liked those empty stretches of asphalt, especially late at night when it was just me, the headlights, and whatever decided to crawl out of the dark. But that night I was alone. I'd gone to town to pick up a few groceries, nothing major, just milk, bread, and dog food, and took the long way back to our house out in the country. The long way meant County Road 19, a two-lane path that curved through woods, cornfields, and about 6 old houses that looked like they hadn't seen a fresh coat of paint since the 1950s. No streetlights, no reflectors, just my headlights cutting through the black. The first thing that felt off was the air. It wasn't just cold, it was heavy. You know that feeling when your ears start to ring slightly, like the air pressure's wrong? That's what it felt like, except it stayed that way the whole time I drove. About 10 minutes in, the fog got so bad I could barely see a few feet ahead. I slowed down to a crawl. The road curved ahead into a narrow one-lane bridge, and since I'd driven that way plenty of times, I knew I had to slow down anyway. That bridge was old, the kind that creaked when you drove over it. Beneath it ran a thin creek that sometimes flooded after rain, but that night it was quiet, too quiet. Just as my front tires reached the start of the bridge, something moved in the fog. A shadow, quick but clear enough that I slammed on the brakes without thinking. My heart jumped into my throat. The car screeched to a stop, and then I saw her. A woman stepped right into the beam of my headlights. She was maybe in her 30s or 40s, barefoot, wearing what looked like a long, pale dress that clung to her like it was damp. Her hair was dark and messy, covering part of her face. For a split second, I thought she might be hurt. Lost, maybe. But then she slammed both hands on the hood of my car. The sound was so loud it made me flinch. My first instinct was to open the door, but something in me said don't. Her head was tilted slightly and her mouth was moving fast, but no sound came out. It wasn't like she was whispering. It was more like watching someone scream with the volume turned off. I froze. The car's engine idled, headlights lighting her up in full detail. Her eyes, at least what I could see through the hair, looked wrong. Too wide, too bright. I tried to convince myself she was just someone in trouble, someone panicking, but the longer I looked, the less human she seemed. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tight my fingers went numb. I pressed the horn, hoping the sound would startle her or make her back away, but it didn't. She didn't even flinch. She just kept pounding the hood, once, twice, 3 times. Each hit softer than the last, like she was losing strength. And then she stopped. She stood there for a second, then slowly turned her head toward the passenger side of my car. My stomach dropped because there was no one there. The passenger seat was empty. She just stared through the glass like she was seeing something I couldn't. Then just as suddenly as she appeared, she stepped backward into the fog and disappeared. It wasn't like she ran. It was like the fog swallowed her whole. I sat there shaking for what felt like forever. The engine was still running, but the headlights were starting to flicker, something that had never happened before. I didn't want to drive forward because that meant crossing the bridge where she'd just been, but staying there felt worse. So I pressed down on the gas and rolled forward, staring dead ahead. Halfway across, I glanced in the rearview mirror. I wish I hadn't. For a moment, just one brief second, I saw a figure standing behind my car, right where the bridge began. Not moving, not chasing, just watching. When I finally got home, I parked in the driveway, turned off the car, and sat there with my hands still trembling on the wheel. I tried to tell myself I'd imagined it. Maybe it was someone who needed help. Maybe she wandered off before I could react. But I went back the next morning, and there were no footprints. No sign anyone had been there at all. The strangest part? My car's hood had faint smudge marks, like 2 handprints, but no dirt, no oil, no fingerprints. Just pale shapes that wouldn't wash off for weeks. I told a few people about it later, but no one believed me. A couple of folks said maybe I saw a deer, or maybe it was fog and headlights playing tricks. I wanted to believe that too, I really did. But I still remember how her hands felt through the metal, the sound, the look in her eyes. Every October when the fog starts rolling across the fields again, I find myself thinking about that night. I still take the same road sometimes, but I slow down long before the bridge now, just in case. And sometimes when the fog gets thick enough, I swear I can see a faint shape at the edge of the light, just standing there, waiting. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe it was all in my head. But every time I drive past that bridge, I keep one hand on the wheel and the other on the horn, just in case the fog decides to breathe again.